Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with Dark Knight's Metal, but this one gets a little crazy. And so I think that before we kick this off, what we need to do is have a discussion about the Overvoid. Now, in reality, it would probably behoove us, since we are Comics Explained, it would probably behoove us to essentially take everything that's happened with regards to Dark Knight's Metal and these additions and creations in relation to like how the multiverse works and all that kind of stuff, to kind of consolidate all of that into a singular video and to make sense of everything that's happened. But for what we're going to do in this video, we're going to have a conversation about the Overvoid, right? Because the Overvoid plays a role in all of this, actually plays a huge role in all of this. So the way this works in DC Comics, right, leaving out like the Dark Multiverse and all that kind of stuff, the way this works in DC Comics is that you have like a singular universe, and DC uses numerical designations for their universes, but unlike Marvel where it's arbitrarily established, DC does it in order, right? So you have Earth 0, then you have Earth 1, then you have Earth 2, you have Earth 3, right? That's kind of how their whole thing goes and works forward from there. Something like Earth 0 or Earth Prime, that's where you read most of these DC comics, ever since the New 52. Now, outside of these individual universes, you have, of course, the multiverse, and you guys know this stuff, right? You guys have the multiverse, a collection of universes. The Presence is basically the one who created the multiverse, right? That's kind of been established over the years in different comics. Crisis on Infinite Earths, the subsequent stories that we've seen like Doomsday Clock, which referenced Crisis on Infinite Earths and solidified the creation of the multiverse by the hand of the Presence in the DC Rebirth landscape, right? So we know it's still in continuity. But the big question to ask here is, if the Presence created the multiverse, who created the Presence? So that's where the Omniverse comes into play. And we've talked about this in Marvel Comics, right? That the Omniverse is basically all the multiverses that exist. So like the multiverse from Marvel Comics and the multiverse from like Spawn, and like if it exists out there in reality, it's part of the Omniverse, right? It's just the Omniverse encompasses everything that currently exists that we are currently aware of, right? So our universe, and assuming that we as human beings here in the real world are part of a multiverse, it includes our multiverse as well. And so the Overvoid was kind of like this introduction by Grant Morrison that was designed to take the place of just saying like all people in creation, right? Now, by and large, Grant Morrison did it in relation to DC Comics, but if you look at the nature of Grant Morrison, it kind of expands beyond DC Comics. And so what we can kind of do is we can look at like the real world here, and we can say like in the 1930s, you had like Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, and you had Harry Donenfeld, and you had Max Gaines, and you had Robert Kanigher, and you had Gardner Fox, and these were the people who basically created DC Comics as we know it today. And then in the 1930s, you also had like Jack Kirby, and you had Joe Simon. They were the ones who created people like Captain America. And then over the years, different writers have contributed to characters in different ways, right? Bob Kane, Bill Finger created Batman. It was just kind of the way these things work. And so when Grant Morrison created the Overvoid in Final Crisis, instead of saying like once upon a time there was Gardner Fox and Max Gaines and Robert Kanigher and Harry Donenfeld and Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson and Gardner Fox and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, instead of like running off all these names, he was just like, in the beginning there was the Overvoid. And that's why you basically have this kind of this depiction in the sense that the Overvoid did not initially become aware of the fact that the DC multiverse existed. Because if you apply this kind of metatextual concept to it, it was basically Grant Morrison saying, before these guys created DC Comics and Marvel Comics, they had lives. They had wives, and they had kids, and they had, you know, friends and family, and they were going to school and all that kind of stuff, right? And it wasn't until later on in their life that they decided to start creating comic books. And that's when they became aware of the existence of things, right? So it's super metatextual, and it can be difficult to wrap your head around, right? There's no denying that. Like, it can be difficult to wrap your head around, but that's kind of how all this whole Overvoid thing works. And so the idea and the reason why this matters is because as we get into this, of course, we've had Metron, who's been dead for quite some time in DC Comics, right? He's been dead for a while, I think ever since the events of Darkseid War. But with the Batman Who Laughs basically achieving the full totality of Dr. Manhattan's powers and becoming this just crazy, powerful, multiversal source of energy, the first thing he does is challenge Perpetua, because Perpetua seems to more or less be equal to himself in power. And these two beings are fighting quite literally for the fate of the multiverse. If you guys are a little confuddled in terms of like the level of power we're talking about here, to put this into context, this was like when the Spectre and the Anti-Monitor fought during Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? It was their fight that destroyed what was left of the multiverse, right? It was just them fighting that laid waste to basically everything. But you're basically talking about two insanely powerful beings here. But the reason why this matters is because while all this has been happening, Dark Knight's metal and the Batman Who Laughs gaining all his power and so on and so forth, the Overvoid has been watching, and the Overvoid is actually curious. And so what the Overvoid does is it basically sends an emissary into the main DC universe, right? Into this particular place right here. I guess we can kind of call it the multiverse if we want to, but basically this being shows up here. It's kind of a chronicler of sorts, and it's curious, right? It's curious what's going on here. And so what it ends up doing is basically teleporting to the hellscape, right? Which is previously Themyscira, and it comes across the Joker, the first person it meets. And it's like, are you the one who drew me here, right? Are you the one whose presence drew me to this place? And then he immediately kind of picks up and says, no, you're just the Joker, right? Like, if anything, you're a nuisance on your Earth, but aside from that, you're wildly insignificant, right? You don't really matter in the greater scheme of things. And then he basically ends up moving to the next cell. And that's when he comes across Roger Hayden, the Psycho Pirate. And the reason why he grabs the Psycho Pirate is because, remember, where you've had events like Crisis on Infinite Earths and 0 Hour Crisis in Time and Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis, one of the things that we've kind of reiterated here is that Crisis on Infinite Earths destroyed the multiverse. Infinite Crisis brought the multiverse back, and Final Crisis made the heroes aware of it. But after each one of these major Crisis events, you would usually see some kind of reboot, right? In the sense that the heroes didn't remember anything that was going on before those Crisis events, or really before Crisis on Infinite Earths. Infinite Crisis and Final Crisis weren't really as grandiose in scale as the original Crisis event. That's why I say DC's only ever rebooted twice. The original Crisis event and the New 52, right? But even when we go into New 52, most people don't remember anything before the New 52. It's why Barry Allen initially forgot who Wally West was. It's why when you had pre-New 52 Superman who showed up in the New 52 universe, people didn't initially know who he was. And then you had the whole Superman Reborn story arc where basically him and the New 52 version merged. And then you got like the original Superman as we know him, right? That kind of a thing. It was kind of a wonky story, but the long and short of this is that Psycho Pirate does remember all of that, right? Psycho Pirate remembers life, remembers how things were before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and he remembers how things were after that, and he remembers everything before the events of Flashpoint, and he knows everything that's been going on since, right? So he's the only true source of knowledge insofar as the entire timeline before, during, and after the crises that DC's had. And so one of the things this guy basically says here is that he's known as Chronicler, right? That's basically his name, right? His name is Chronicler, and that he has what's called the Codex Omniverse, and that he is a person that's sent into a universe to chronicle the universe, document why it is that it's dying, and then leave. And that's basically it. That's his whole purpose. He's more or less just like a librarian, right? Just a chronicler. And so as he goes through here, and as he looks into the mind of Psycho Pirate, he basically recalls everything, right? Like the original Justice Society of America before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, the heroes as they existed after, and then everything that came after the event of Flashpoint, right? New 52. And so when he's looking at that, like, it immediately strikes him as interesting because he's kind of like, this multiverse is remarkable, right? It's not like most multiverses that I've seen that have been destroyed, where there aren't really any superheroes there, right? Where it's basically just kind of mundane. This is a little strange to me. And so from there, like, it kind of piques his interest, you know? And he's like, let's see what else is here. The funny thing about it is that when he explains himself and says, like, I'm always sent into a multiverse when the multiverse is about to die, it kind of strikes Psycho Pirate like, wait a minute, like, this is the end, right? This is how it ends. The funny thing about this too is Psycho Pirate tries to use his Medusa mask on Chronicler. It doesn't work, right? And we'll find out more about why it doesn't work here in a minute. I mean, he kind of offers an explanation and saying that he's incapable of feeling for the dead. And so basically it's kind of him saying like, this multiverse is going to die. And so because you're a dead man, I don't really feel anything for you. But the reason why the Medusa mask doesn't work is actually a little deeper than that, right? Well, not really deeper, but it's a little different than that. And so from there, he ends up teleporting to another location and is immediately met by like all these different robots, right? These kind of, you know, drones and so on. And he wipes them out with a wave of his hand, and they're all totally destroyed, which proves to be a big deal because these are the forces of Vril Dox, right? The son of Brainiac. So you're talking about the son of like a 12th level intelligence who created these drones that would be a challenge for someone like Superman, right? Let alone an army of them. And so this guy's power is pretty high up there. But as he starts talking to Vril Dox, the funny thing about this is that Vril Dox says he's been sending signals into the greater Omniverse to basically find a way to escape this multiverse before its inevitable death, right? So Vril Dox knows the multiverse is going to die, right? He knows knows this is going to happen, that everything is going to end. And that's why I say Dark Knight's Metal is in effect a crisis event. It's leading to the death of the multiverse. And that's usually what a crisis means. It means like they're going to reboot or something along those lines, right? It's kind of become part and parcel with DC nomenclature ever since the original crisis event, right? It's just kind of what it means. Now, the funny thing about this is that Vril Dox had registered an incursion from the Omniverse, basically meaning like he registered this guy arriving, right? You know, Chronicler arriving from the Omniverse. And that's why he kind of knew it was only a matter of time before the Chronicler came here. And so what he does is actually pitch him a deal. And he says, here's what I'll do. If you take me out of this multiverse and take me to a better multiverse that'll actually survive, then I will give you all the recorded history that's inside the databanks that belong to my father Brainiac, right? Every world he ever recorded across all of his existence across the multiverse, right? I'll give you all that stuff. And so the response of Chronicler is, well, I mean, I do appreciate you giving me all that, but I'm not authorized to make deals with dead men, basically saying, I'm not going to take you to a new multiverse. And instead, what he actually ends up doing is basically absorbing that knowledge from Vril Dox and then looking around, right? Because Vril Dox offers him an explanation on like everything outside of Earth. The Psycho-Pirate never really functioned outside of Earth, right? He was never part of the Green Lantern Corps or part of like the New Gods or anything along those lines. And so you actually end up having him, having Vril Dox offering that kind of explanation, right? Showing him that information. And the crazy thing is Chronicler looks at this and says, there's so much power in this universe. How could you let it get to this point? Like, how could you let your multiverse get to this point where it's on the verge of collapse? That it doesn't make any sense, right? You have enough power to overthrow virtually any threat you face. How could you let it get to this point? Now, where Vril Dox initially tries to take over the Chronicler and then says, like, I intend to use your power to leave this place, the Chronicler's response is, do you really want to see what lies beyond your reality? Do you really want to see the sorts of multiverses I've recorded as they've died? And that's when he shows him the Codex Omniverse. Now, we don't necessarily see what's in the Codex Omniverse, but we're given an explanation of what is in there. And what the Chronicler basically tells us is that, like, among the various multiverses that he's seen, this one is the only one that really has the kind of power that's being displayed here. That within this multiverse that exists here, that this one's unique. Now, if I'm also a betting man, assuming the Chronicler has visited like the Marvel multiverse, it's kind of DC Comics basically saying our multiverse is better, right? That's kind of what it is. That's kind of what they're saying here. But the overall point is that there is nothing else out there, right? And this kind of comes by way of the response of Vril Dox when the Chronicler leaves, right? When the Chronicler's like, I require more knowledge. Your knowledge is far too limited, right? I require a better understanding of this whole universe that's out there. And he basically ends up taking off. But the response of Vril Dox is, no, there has to be something better out there, right? There has to be something better than this place. But the response of the Chronicler is, no, you didn't cherish what you had, right? Your multiverse is coming to an end, and it sucks because your multiverse was so special. And so it's kind of like, if I took you to a different multiverse, it wouldn't be nearly as good as this one. And in fact, it would probably suck. It would be worse, right? So I'd be taking you to a worse place, which is not going to happen. And so what he ends up doing is traveling to the moon, right? Teleporting to the moon in the midst of this massive battle, right? Between Perpetua and the Batman who laughs, right? The Dr. Manhattan who laughs kind of character. And he actually ends up picking up the skull of Metron and then basically says, like, I need clarity from one who has seen this universe as I'm seeing it now, an observer. So basically he wants to better understand this universe as it exists in the moment. And Metron is the only one who can do that, right? He's the only one who surveyed the entirety of the universe and gathered as much information as he possibly can. It's the nature of Metron, right? It's what he does. And so what he does here is basically resurrect this guy from the dead. And so what this gives us is this indication that Chronicler is an almost nigh omnipotent character. This guy is huge in terms of power. The other part of this is we get some massive explanations and exposition insofar as how all this kind of hierarchy stands, right? The presence, all that kind of stuff. And so when Metron wakes up, it's basically like he's been dead all this time, right? So he doesn't really know anything about Dark Knight's Metal, the Batman who laughs, any of that stuff. He's been dead this whole time. And so it's kind of like when Chronicler kind of explains it all to him, he's just sort of like, wow, okay, so Perpetua apparently was locked in the Source Wall. She was the creator of this multiverse as it exists. That's kind of crazy, right? She was defeated. She was locked inside the Source Wall. The whole multiverse was recreated by her sons, right? And then she manipulated the Anti-Monitor into becoming the villain that he was, which led to the second crisis, right? So Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? It led to that event. And then she's kind of just been manipulating things ever since so she could eventually escape the Source Wall and then usurp control of the multiverse, right? So damn, this is kind of crazy. And then the Batman who laughs is a version of Batman from the Dark Multiverse, and then he ended up getting the power of Dr. Manhattan who came here from a different universe. And then like it's he basically gets the full explanation of everything that's been going on here. And the idea is that as he talks to the Chronicler is saying things like, I wish to understand why things are the way they are. How did your multiverse get to this point? And the response of Metron here is, I'm a passive observer. I just watch everything from a macro scale. And that's when he kind of picks up on the fact that the function of the Chronicler is to simply observe. But what he wants to do is actually fix things, right? It's to fix this multiverse and make it right the way that it's supposed to be. So when he says yes, right, when the Chronicler's more or less like yes, then at the end of the day, Metron is like, okay, it's kind of difficult to explain, right? But what he basically establishes here is that Metron himself is part of the New Gods, and the New Gods represent absolute good versus absolute evil, or seemingly absolute good versus absolute evil. The nature of these characters and the nature of this is almost kind of metatextual, that you have heroes who exist in this universe and within the multiverse itself. And the idea is that the heroes are effectively written by, DC writers represented by the Overvoid in such a way to where they will always find a way to overcome. It's why every villain doesn't kill Superman. It's why the Joker doesn't kill Batman every single time they fight, right? It's why Superman hasn't died yet. Well, I guess he kind of did, but he ended up coming back. It's why the superheroes basically always win. It's because it's the Overvoid representing DC Comics writers that engineer ways by which the heroes will always come out on top. And that's why he says things like the Omniverse is finite, because while the Omniverse does represent all things that currently exist, then there are only so many things that we as human beings have created. If you go through and you say, like, if you were to catalog a list of everything that every human being has created insofar as like a story that exists out there, then sure, there'd be a lot, right? There'd be millions and millions and millions and millions of stories, but they stop at a certain number, right? They don't go on forever. We don't look around and say, there are an infinite number of stories that we as human beings have created with regards to things like Spawn, or like the Twilight Zone, or the Outer Limits TV show, or something like that. There's only so many of these things that we've created over the years, right? Over our existence. Now, that number will continue to grow the longer that humanity exists, but at the moment right now, there's only a finite number there, but the potential is limitless. The potential of what we as people can create is limitless. And so the idea of what Metron says here is that because of the fact that everything that exists within the Omniverse, so like Marvel Comics, DC Comics, all that kind of stuff, that all exists because of the fact that people created it. And so even if DC were to just close up shop right now, right, is really what Metron's saying. Even if this multiverse were to die and never be reborn, right? So like DC finishes Dark Knight's Metal and says, okay guys, the book is shut, they fire everybody, and they say, we're no longer making comic books. Then like the memories of everything that's happened here will continue to live on, right? The Omniverse representing Scott Snyder and Jeff Johns and all these people who are currently contributing to or have contributed to DC Comics and are still alive. And even us as the reader, we will all remember this. Even if we can never read a DC comic again after this, we'll all say like, hey, remember that story with Superman? That's how those things will live on. And so that's kind of it's exceedingly metatextual here, but the Chronicler still doesn't quite grasp it. And so the way this ends is that Metron says, fine, then it's easier to show you than it is to tell you. And so what he basically ends up doing is kind of blasting him with the full totality of what it means to truly understand the Codex Omniversa. He basically gives him true knowledge, like an almost beyond multiversal and omniversal cosmic awareness. Seemingly what he does is kind of introduce the Chronicler to us. Basically tell us like about the real world. That kind of seems to be what happens. Whether or not that's actually the case, I don't really know, right? It's just, I'm just kind of suspecting here. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Now I'll catch you all later. Peace.